G'day cocktail lovers. I heard it was Bourbon Heritage Month, and anyone who knows me knows I like to feature local spirits and liqueurs as much as possible. I thought, why not show an Australian bourbon? Now, people who know bourbon will be saying, you can't do that. There are rules about making bourbon, and a great big one that gets in the way is it must be made in the continental United States. So it's a bit of a cheat for me to say I'm going to tell you about an Australian bourbon because it can't be bourbon. But I did get this bottle recently and it follows all the rules of making bourbon apart from the fact it's made in Western Australia. This is actually part of my birthday present this year from Mrs. Angry. Great present, she got me a subscription where I essentially get a mystery bottle every 3 months. Great way to discover new things, because I certainly never would have discovered this whiskey on my own. And I was very interested that they said, oh, we followed all the rules for making bourbon apart from not being in the United States. So I thought it might be fun to compare it. Now, the part of Western Australia it comes from, southern Western Australia, is not a climate like Kentucky or anything like that. It's probably more like Northern California. For a hoot, I actually have a Californian bourbon. And I thought, let's start off this exploration of Australian whiskies by comparing the two. Colour-wise, they're very similar. On the nose, the Australian whiskey's got a very vanilla notes that is common for bourbon. I feel like the Californian bourbon, a bit less vanilla, probably a little bit sharper on the aroma. And in terms of taste, very much the sort of taste I associate with American bourbons. For me, there's a bit of honey in there, even just a little bit of cinnamon maybe, and yeah, the vanilla flavour that you get so often. Comparing it to the Californian bourbon, that's a lighter and somewhat sharper flavour to me. Let's compare the alcohol content. Might explain it. The Australian one's 40% alcohol by volume. Sonoma County Distilling, west of Kentucky bourbon, 47.5%. That would probably account for the fact that the taste is a bit sharper. There's a little bit more burn. Overall though, they're both quite good whiskies. For fun, I thought I would take the exploration and comparison a bit further. Let's go into rye whiskies. An American rye. This is High West Double Rye. This is from Utah. This comes in at 46% alcohol. What I have here is from Melbourne distillery, The Gospel. They're actually Australia's only specialist rye distiller. They only make rye whiskies. This is one of their limited runs, their fortified cask. It's 52%, being finished in a range of fortified wine casks. So even just colour, the High West is much lighter than the Gospel one, and I think that's the fortified wine barrels have a lot to do with that. Let's do a taste comparison. Okay, on the nose, there's a nice floral element to the High West rye. It's really quite pleasant, and the Gospel one is definitely the sort of deeper, richer notes that you can tell this has been in wine barrels. Now for taste, it has that characteristic rye spice in there. This is also much sweeter for my palate than the bourbon styles were. The Gospel one, not as sweet as the High West, definitely getting those fortified wine notes in there and the traditional rye spice as well. And at 52%, you do feel a little bit of alcohol burn. Surprisingly easy to drink though. These are both very pleasant as well. As an excuse to keep drinking whiskey, I thought, let's do another comparison. This one with peated whiskies. I've got Scotch, Talisker 10-year-old, and this one from Australian distillery Bakery Hill. Cute little sample bottle. I got this for myself for Father's Day. They had a little tasting set of some of their whiskies, and you got the little tasting glasses with it that I've been using in these comparisons. So I thought I'd do a comparison, traditional Scotch and an Australian peated whiskey. These are very similar strengths. They're both about 46% alcohol by volume, somewhat similar in colour as well. On the nose, you'll be shocked to hear that's smoky. Smells like peat. And the Australian one, it's a bit lighter than the Talisker, but still those smoky notes that you would expect. And in terms of taste, nice burnt honey notes in that, and the peat really lingers. And for the Australian one, less sweet than the Talisker, still really nice. In terms of aging, the Talisker is a 10-year-old. Bakery Hill tend to age their whiskies for 6 to 8 years, which is longer than the majority of Australian whiskies. Like bourbons, you'll tend to get Australian whiskies that are aged for about 3 years. The people at Bakery Hill, bit more serious. They really like to put some age in there, and they've come up with a good result. If you like peated whiskies, they've absolutely got you covered. If you don't already know, something that might give you pause for getting into Australian spirits in general is price. They can be quite expensive. Certainly within Australia, there's a lot of tax placed on spirits, and for the Australian makers that have exported overseas, it costs quite a bit to ship from Australia to other parts of the world. So it may be more expensive than you're used to. So even if you see any Australian whiskies in your area, I have no idea how much they'll be, but you might be brought up a little short by the price. And I haven't even been doing some of the more expensive ones. The Bakery Hill is possible. I have a full bottle of theirs. That's possibly the most expensive whiskey I own. But there are whiskies, particularly from the Lark Distillery in Tasmania, that just keep going up and up. Like, use your imagination. They go from $400 up to several $1,000s because they've also been doing it the longest. They've actually got a 30-year vintage because that's how long they've been doing it. Longest running Australian whiskey distillery. In fact, Bill Lark is responsible for the renaissance of Australian distilling, so more power to him. I guess he gets to charge more for his whiskies. This brand is a real up-and-comer around the world, Starward. The distillery is actually not that far away from me, down the road. They make very good whiskies. They recently, in some world awards, they got the award for winning the most awards. They're doing very well. This is what I'd call the entry-level whiskey. They call it twofold because it's a blend of grain whiskies, and it's 40% alcohol by volume, what you'd expect. This retails locally for about the same price that Buffalo Trace does. I'm not sure if that would maintain consistency around the world, but they also do some single malts, and this is one of their more expensive ones. Solera is bordering on twice as expensive as this. The prices fluctuate a bit, but this single malt can be twice as expensive as twofold. So I thought for fun, instead of comparing Australian to around the world, I was going to compare entry-level whiskey to noticeably more expensive single malt. Visually, they're really similar looking. On the nose, it's really the twofold sort of honey and spice, a little bit similar on the nose at least to how the ryes were. The single malt Solera, as aged in fortified wine barrels, it's much more subtle on the nose. Ooh, there's a real sort of richness and depth to it. It smells really nice, but the twofold, taste-wise, it's a really nice whiskey. It's like really easy to drink. Goes down easy, almost no burn. Great for mixing. I use that in cocktails a lot. Mind you, I use my expensive single malts in cocktails all the time, which would probably freak out hardcore whiskey snobs that I do that, but it's what I like, so it's what I'm going to do. But the Solera, for comparison taste-wise, there's a lot more going on with the single malt. It's got really deep, rich flavours. No slight on twofold. It's much more affordable and it's really nice and easy to drink. But in terms of just really getting some complexity in there, the single malt is definitely at another level. One of the reasons you pay more for them. But yeah, that's my little potted review of just a very small number of Australian whiskies. If you get the chance, wherever you are in the world, Australia or somewhere else, I thoroughly recommend trying it. I am quite parochial, as most people who watch the channel will realise, but the fact these whiskies keep winning awards in global competitions means it's not just my bias. There's some genuinely world-class whiskies being made in Australia, and the majority of them are aged in used barrels. As I said, the first one I did followed the bourbon rules, so it was aged in new American oak. Most tend to be aged in either wine barrels. We have a huge wine industry here, and some people import ex-bourbon and ex-Scotch barrels, and you'll find all sorts of variations around Australia. But there's an incredible diversity, broadly very high quality. I have to thank my friend Kirsten, who works at an Australian distillery, that she got me into Australian product during COVID lockdowns and really opened my eyes to the breadth and depth of what's available locally. And while I'm trumpeting Australian, wherever you are in the world, I'm willing to bet there are some really good quality independent distilleries not too far from you. It's always worth seeking them out, finding something new. You might find a new favourite. I'm just going to finish these off and then ease back into a comfortable chair for a while so I don't fall over. Hope you look after yourself in the meantime. Until I see you again, cheers.